California, a hand-me-down history by O.L. Monty, Dewey. Copyright 1989, San Francisco Bay Wildlife Society. Forward. If you read the old newspaper accounts of Drawbridge, you'll sometimes find it described in a derogatory way. There was a lawlessness and freebooting, an element of low types on the lam from the city who treated Drawbridge as a kind of a hole in the wall, beyond the reach of the sheriff. Its residents did not agree, and the following story is an attempt to show the true picture of Drawbridge as told by people who lived there. My mother was the marshland. My father was the railroad. I was born in 1876 after they met on Station Island. Some now say that I'm a ghost town, sinking in the mud. Maybe I am, but I hate that name. So do the people who remember. They remember the independent spirit, the close friendships, the happy days, and their paradise that was lost. Chapter 1. The Railroad, South Pacific Coast Railway Company. It would be impossible to write about Drawbridge without discussing the direct effect the railroad had on this hamlet. For without the railroad, it is most unlikely that Drawbridge would ever have existed. One stormy night in 1877, two California characters sat across the table from each other at the Collins Saloon, Oyster, and Chop House in San Francisco, California. Those two large-bodied, self-made men were Senator James G. Fair and Alfred C. Davis. Mr. Fair had made his millions in the Comstock Mother Lode, was a state senator, and received his nickname, Slippery Jim, from his friends on Montgomery Street. Mr. Davis made his money by raising hogs and potatoes in San Francisco and sold them to eager buyers at gold rush inflated prices. It was said that he earned his nickname, Hog, by doing so. It was also said that it wasn't he who raised the hogs and earned the name, but his brother Samuel, the general manager. Fair and Davis had been discussing the transportation problems in the Bay Area and had come to the conclusion that it would be profitable to build a narrow-gauge railroad from the proposed site of Newark, California, to Santa Cruz, California. They knew the difficulties involved and the possibility of failure. They also knew that they would be going into direct competition with Leland Stanford and his Southern Pacific standard gauge line. Standard gauge rails are approximately 4 feet 8 inches apart, while narrow gauge is anything less. Leland Stanford had, for a long time, wanted to expand his Bay Area line into Santa Cruz. This coastal town had an open port, beautiful beaches, and was a good prospect for growth and enterprise. In 1857, the stage from San Francisco to Santa Cruz took 2 days one way. It went from San Francisco to San Jose, San Juan Bautista, and Watsonville, about 100 miles. In addition to the discomfort of riding on the stage, the cost was $13 one way. With lodging and meals, it ran to $40 in gold. In 1874, Stanford did put his railroad into Watsonville. He bought the Santa Cruz Railroad in 1881, which gave him the trackage rights into Santa Cruz. A one-way ticket cost $3.50. It took the same route as the stage, but it only took 4 hours and 12 minutes. San Franciscans could now go to Santa Cruz just for the day. Then, in 1876, Hog Davis became interested in laying a narrow-gauge track from Newark to Santa Cruz. Davis had purchased the bankrupt narrow-gauge Santa Clara Valley Railroad in 1875. It is probable that Davis had Fair's backing at this time. The railroad was connected to Alviso, San Jose, and Santa Clara. It had gone bankrupt trying to build a line into the Santa Cruz Mountains. The Santa Clara Valley Railroad also had planned to extend the line into Mission San Jose, Washington Corners, Centerville, Newark, and Alvarado. Surveying for the new line began in 1874. It progressed across the marshes until the barrier of Warm Springs Slough stopped the work. Both Warm Springs Slough and Coyote Slough were navigable waterways that the United States law required be kept open. The importance of these waterways to commerce on the bay cannot be overestimated. In the late 1800s, most hay, fruit, vegetables, salt, and other products of the land were shipped across the bay to San Francisco from the surrounding rural communities in scow schooners. These two-masted watercraft employed a hinged centerboard to enable them to navigate the shallow water of the sloughs. A fisherman's sail installed atop the mainsail, made up for the partial blocking of the mainsail's lower portion by the banks of the sloughs at low tide. The Santa Clara Valley Railroad's original plan was to span the two sloughs with twin drawbridges and lay their tracks across the island in between. This did not happen because they went bankrupt. Enter Hogg Davis, who bought the Santa Clara Valley Railroad with cash and became its sole owner. His South Pacific Coast Transportation Company was chartered on March 25, 1876. This new acquisition brought Mr. Davis in direct competition with the Stanford line in transporting farm produce. Davis also encountered opposition from the farmers themselves, who feared higher transportation costs. Davis promised the farmers lower rates in Southern Pacific, but because his line sounded a lot like the Stanford line, they feared that Stanford and Davis were in cahoots. Then, on March 30, 1876, a typo appeared in the San Jose Mercury that nearly undid Davis. They called his line the Southern Pacific Coast. Farmers thought for sure that Stanford would control costs. Davis came right back with a denial. The name of his company was the South Pacific Coast Railroad, and he said, "You may be sure that South Pacific Coast Railroad is entirely independent of any man or set of men connected with the Southern Pacific or Central Pacific line." Enter his friend, James G. Fair, who bought into the company with controlling shares. This led to the meeting at Collins Saloon on that stormy night in 1877. In that meeting, plans were laid for the new railroad and for a spin-off project, the new town of Newark, California. Approximately 50 acres of land was purchased in what would become Newark, and a roundhouse, repair shed, and bandstand were built there. Manufacturers were encouraged to locate in Newark, and people were encouraged to build houses there. Chinese labor laid the narrow-gauge track south from Newark to Warm Springs Slough, using the same plan as the Santa Clara Valley Railroad had developed. Important engineers built iron truss swing bridges across both Warm Springs and Coyote Sloughs. The South Pacific Coast Railroad bought a 100-foot right-of-way across the island between the sloughs from the Dumbarton Land and Improvement Company, and now laid their narrow-gauge line right through the middle. The bridges were hand-operated and rotated around central piers to swing open for water traffic. The South Pacific Coast Railroad continued across the March 12 ESO to connect up with the old Santa Clara Valley Railroad line. Davis and Fair envisioned a line from Newark to Santa Cruz by the Santa Cruz Mountains. Stanford had been wary of trying to go through the mountains, but Davis and Fair were not afraid. They spent $6 million on the construction of a series of tunnels that were driven through that barrier and opened a shorter way to Santa Cruz. On the northern end of the line, the plan was to ferry people from Dumbarton Point in Newark to San Francisco using their newly built ferry, Newark, the elegant Queen of the Bay. Newark was a huge 300-foot long by 80-foot wide ship driven by two 42-foot diameter side wheels. Two sister ships were built in 1879. Each required a master mariner as captain and a crew of 28. When it became apparent that ferrying passengers from Newark to San Francisco would be too slow, Davis decided to extend the line into Alameda and run the ferry service from there. Davis and Fair opened their new railroad in May of 1880. It included a ferry ride to Alameda, a long stretch over the marshlands, and a long climb through the tunnels to Santa Cruz. The route was 80 miles long and lasted 3 hours and 30 minutes. During construction of the railroad, the two owners developed different ideas on how to run the company. They began to drift apart. The distance between the partners widened. Fair, suspecting financial manipulation, seized the presidency of the company. The two former friends had a parting of the ways. The South Pacific Coast Railroad became a tremendous moneymaker. When Fair leased the line to the Southern Pacific in 1887, it was the most profitable railroad per mile of track in the entire state. Chapter 2. The Early Years, 1876 to 1927. Everything has to have a beginning. When the South Pacific Coast Railroad built a two-room cabin for the bridge tender, that was the beginning of the Drawbridge. They built halfway between Coyote Slough and Warm Springs Slough. now called Mud Slough, although some drawbridgers will take exception. Station Island was an unlikely area for a settlement. To some, it might appear to be a stark, flat mud island without trees, shrubbery, or flowers. It also had a number of major problems for prospective builders. There weren't any roads to the island, so the only access was by rail or boat. At an altitude of 20 feet above mean sea level, with tides of 6 feet or more, cabins built on the marsh could be flooded twice a day. Sidewalks or streets laid down in the marsh would just sink. There would be no municipal provision for water, sewage, or power. It would be too remote for quick response by the police or fire department. So how did the people who went out there solve these problems? First, they didn't see just a flat mud island. They saw a beautiful green carpet of pickleweed and marsh grasses as far as the eye could see, which softened the rough contours of the sloughs the same way that snow can beautify the brown and gray landscape of winter. This green carpet didn't have flowers, but was highlighted by brilliant patches of orange dodder. They could see the expanse of the blue-green bay and the Santa Cruz Mountains to the west, farmlands and Mission Hills to the east. The railroad provided easy and cooperative access to the island. Boats, which were being used for hunting in the South Bay, provided access as well. Cabins and outbuildings could be built on pilings or sills, along with any connecting walkways that might be needed. The railroad bed would become the main street. Fresh water would be found in wells. Outhouses poised over sloughs served as toilets that were flushed twice a day by the tides. Lanterns and lamps would serve as lighting. Wood, coal, and oil would supply the fuel. Over 100 years ago, all of this was common practice. Alviso and Newark would serve as the post offices for the few people who lived on Drawbridge full time. Station Island had some other redeeming qualities. In the fall, the island and surrounding marshes were the stopping-off place for thousands of waterfowl. Mallards, teal, widgeon, and ruddy ducks, to mention a few. The unpolluted sloughs offered a home for crabs, clams, oysters, shrimps, mussels, striped bass, and salmon. This was common knowledge to the Bay Area sportsmen. Again, a hand-me-down history must tell how it was. The following are statements made by inhabitants and hunters of those early days. You wouldn't go down there if you weren't a different breed of cat. Sure, you had to be willing to rough it. Everybody liked it, so they went through a lot of hard times to get there. It wasn't the easiest place for access. Every duck you got, you worked for. And like these people that went down, they were in another world. They were completely away from civilization. William McCall, Sr. It was a warm, friendly town where you knew everybody and everybody knew you. It was a wonderful place where we had a lot of fun when we were young. San Jose Mercury, 1964. It wasn't really a fancy rich people's place. No, it was a do-it-yourself all the way through. There wasn't much expense involved in fixing those places up. It was a tremendous effort. Lots of man-hours, but fun. Yeah, if you didn't like it, you certainly wouldn't be down there. But it wasn't a disease. That Drawbridge mud just calls to you. Charlie Luce. The first bridge tender's name has been given as George Manderscheid, Munderscheitz, and Munderscharer by 3 different sources. His primary 24-hour-a-day job was to open the bridges by hand crank when a boat blew its whistle for passage. This went along fine for a while. Then some of the young people from Alviso Marina invented a game to have some fun with a bridge tender. They would blow their whistle at the Coyote Slough Bridge. George would leave his cabin, walk the 1/4 mile to the bridge, and open it. About the time he had it closed, the same boat would be at the Warm Springs Bridge blowing its whistle. Well, George wasn't a young man and was on the stout side. He just didn't see the humor in this game. It wasn't long before a 24-hour notice had to be given before a bridge was opened. He was also given a secondary job as telegrapher for the railroad. George did his part in getting the community started. He began to let his friends come out and spend the night in his cabin while they were out hunting. He must have been an entrepreneur at heart, as he soon began to charge 50 cents a night for the privilege. The Gordon Gun Club seems to have the honor of being the first cabin built after the bridge tender's cabin was erected. It had a unique Dutch curved roof and was built with old-fashioned square nails. It is thought to have been built in 1880. There are two different versions of who built it. One says that a ship's captain built it to look like the cabin on his ship. The other was that a couple of railroad men built it to look like an early train car. It was a typical Dutch club cabin with two rooms. One room was the kitchen and living room, the other bedroom or bunk room. As the South Pacific Coast Railroad wasn't completed from Alameda to Santa Cruz until 1880, it is probable that not too many people saw the possibilities of the island until then. In that same year, South Pacific Coast Railroad had two trains listed on the operating schedule as stopping at Drawbridge on Sunday. The number 3 stopped in the early morning on its way to Santa Cruz, and the number 36 in the evening on the way back. The stopover became very popular, and the South Pacific Coast Railroad set up an old baggage car at one time and several chair cars at another time on the siding. These were free accommodations for hunters. Duck hunters' cabins and blinds were quite numerous by 1890, but the first permanent residence wasn't built until 1894. By the early 1900s, there were about 40 buildings. By 1897, the railroad officially named the stop Drawbridge and erected a formal sign on the bridge tender's cabin station. Drawbridge had been formally recognized. It looked like the town now had a future. Rumor quite often is much more interesting and dramatic than fact. A case in point was not about Drawbridge, but about the trains that went through it. In 1882, a rumor spread through the island community that a whole train had derailed and sunk in the mud out of sight. The truth was that an engine had derailed into the sink near San Lorenzo. The sink was a stretch of track that kept sinking no matter how much gravel was put under the rails. The engine derailed and lay on its side with the fireman, Dan Driscoll, trapped in the cabin. As the engine sank, all efforts were made to save him, but to no avail. Mr. Joe Sprung and his wife Hedvig, who had immigrated from Germany, built the Sprung Hotel in 1902. It was located on the west side of the tracks, midway down the island. The Sprung Hotel was a large one-story building, impressive in the surroundings of Drawbridge. It had a screened-in front porch where they sometimes had special dinners, such as on the 4th of July. One end of the hotel through the front porch into a long hall. On the right was a big kitchen that produced great German dinners. To the left was a dining room with white lace curtains on the windows and tablecloths on the tables. In the evenings, the tablecloths came off, revealing little shelves used for poker chips and cards. Further down the hall were the bedrooms, which were about 6 by 9 feet. Each was rather Spartan, being furnished with a single bed and a nightstand with a basin and water pitcher. To the right was the bar and all-purpose room. Mrs. Sprung, who was quite often called Auntie, kept the hotel neat and clean. The interior of the hotel was light and airy, and was a meeting place for residents, hunters, and railroaders. The hotel had a deep well and the largest water tank on the island. An often told tale about Joe Sprung is a derailment story. Early on an April morning in 1906, the Southern Pacific, which had gained control of the South Pacific Coast Railroad in 1887, was adding a third rail to the line so it could run both narrow and standard gauge equipment. Joe was not too happy with the crew doing the work since they started very early and were very noisy. Suddenly the hotel shook and part of it collapsed. Joe grabbed a gun and ran outside. Someone was going to pay. He thought a train had derailed and hit the hotel. The railroad crew finally calmed him down and explained it was an earthquake. The Great Quake of 1906 did quite a bit of damage to the town, threw the North Bridge out of alignment, and according to legend, cracked its new date plate, which had been solidly riveted on when the old bridges were replaced in 1904. As 500 or so people came out to Drawbridge on a weekend during duck season, the hotel was usually full. On many occasions, Mrs. Sprung would rent out her bed and sleep in her bathtub. When Prohibition came along in 1920, Mrs. Sprung turned the bar into a small grocery store. She started making home brew and selling it for 25 cents a quart. According to several people, it was great beer. Drawbridge's other hotel was called the Hunter's Home. It was built in 1902 by Louis de Mit. His wife Susan ran it for some years. She remarried, although the records are not clear as to whether Louis died or was divorced, and she ran the hotel by herself as Susan de Mit Russell. It was located on the south end of the island west of the tracks and was smaller than the Sprung. It had a large ballroom and windows all the way around. It boasted a baby grand piano, and the ballroom was decorated with stuffed birds. The Hunter's Home was remembered as a great place for parties and family gatherings. It was also the place some of the newspapers said was a house of ill repute, and it had a roulette wheel with girls' names on it. People who remember the place say it wasn't so. There was a wheel, but it was for gambling ducks. A hunter could bet a duck. If he won $1. If he lost a duck. Selling ducks was against the law beginning in 1910, so the wheel was one way to supply the hotel's kitchen with ducks. Duck dinners at that time went for 35 cents. The hotel had a 400-foot deep well for water, but it is not known whether they supplied anyone else. Rumor also has it that funerals were held at the Hunter's Home. Drawbridge was quite a community by 1906. It lay on a strip of land 7/8 of a mile wide, occupying about 80 acres. It had the 2 hotels and about 79 cabins that were either duck clubs or private residences. However, it was really 2 communities divided along religious and ethnic lines. The south end of town was where most of the Catholics settled, people of Irish, Portuguese, French, Italian, and a few of German background. At the north end lived the Protestants, mostly of English, and a few of German background. The north and south residents apparently did not get along very well. The community never incorporated. There is no fire department or police department. For police and fire protection, the people relied on services from what is now the Fremont area. Drawbridge had no doctors, dentists, stores, or industries. Only the 2 hotels and some boat builders. However, there were people who lived there full-time. The hotel owners and their help, boat builders, and those who made their living building or repairing the cabins. Among the full-time residents was the enterprising John Pacheco, who occasionally killed a harbor seal, rendered out its oil, and sealed roofs with it. Billy Robinson, built scull boats at the north end. These were strictly a South Bay design, with a hole in the transom for a sweep oar, and were propelled through the water with a figure-8 action. A man by the name of Reinhardt built power boats, and another by the name of Adams built sailboats, both at the north end. There were other casual boat builders too on the island, as everybody had at least 1 or 2 boats. Most of the cabins were built 50 feet back from the tracks to be off of the railroad right-of-way. Some of the people bought their property from the Dumbarton Land and Improvement Company. Others claimed squatters' rights, and their ownership finally was accepted by the county. A railroad track was sometimes called Main Street or A Street. Every cabin had to be built on stilts to protect it from the tides. Each house had an elevated walkway to the railroad track. The railroad charged $1 a year for the privilege of setting their walkway on the railroad property. Many people built walkways to their neighbors' cabins for easy, friendly access. If needed, they built high bridges over sloughs so boats could navigate beneath them. In newspaper articles written in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, the people of Drawbridge were said to be rather low class, gamblers, prostitutes, and gangsters, who used the community like a hole in the wall. However, most of the cabin owners were in reality middle-class people. They were doctors, dentists, store owners, and businessmen. It appears that the newspapers highlighted the unsavory incidences that sometimes happen in Drawbridge, as they do in almost any community, and ignored the positive aspects of the island. Most people built their own cabins and maintained them. These cabins were of a great many designs, from single or 2-room affairs with an outhouse to larger and more elegant places with built-in cabinets and outside toilets. However, all toilets led out into the slough. The flooring in the cabins varied greatly from plain wood floors to tile or linoleum. Walls were covered with wood paneling, burlap, or wallpaper. One was even insulated with old newspaper printing plates. Many had flower boxes, and a few had glassed-in rooms for flowers and plants. The roofs were quite often covered with redwood shingles that have stood up against the elements even to this day. That seal oil may have helped. Most of the cabins had names, including the Fricata, Gordon Gun Club, Recreation, Widgeon, Harbor View, Sprig, Sorry, Don't Worry, and others. Nameplates were usually mounted right over the door. Some of the people also put up flagpoles and flew the American flag when they were there. In addition to the cabins that were built on the island, another kind of dwelling was used. These were known as arks, houseboats pulled up on the marsh and hoisted up on pilings. Sally's Ark and the Old Ark were two examples. The most unique ark was a Matson-lined 50-passenger lifeboat. It was also pulled up on the marsh and a cabin built on it. There was never any lack of ingenuity in Drawbridge. There were several wells which tapped the freshwater aquifer underneath the island and could be hooked right up to the sink. The story goes that one man hooked up his well to a water wheel that operated a saw. Along with the home brew made at the Sprung Hotel, people made wine, and there's also some evidence that the clear water was used by one small whiskey still in the town. It appears there was only one telephone on the island. It belonged to the railroad and was kept in a locked box at the station. Several people fashioned their own keys to have access if needed. The impossibility of quick response from the fire and police departments would plague the residents as long as the town existed. Sometimes the railroad would send a water tank car to help, and firefighters from what is now the Newark, Fremont area would come out with backpacks. Coyote Slough, at the island's south end, was the Alameda-Santa Clara County line. If a sheriff was needed, he couldn't come from the south because he had no jurisdiction to cross the line. Police from the Fremont area weren't too anxious to come out either. Drawbridge was hard to get to, and in truth was an armed camp, because the residents all had guns. With the coming of World War I, the island's two bridges were the keys to two important waterways. The government was fearful of sabotage and placed soldiers there. One bridge tender was replaced by three, working 8-hour shifts. They were William Carrera, the chief tender, Lewis Holden, and Jim Hardy. Their duties were opening the bridge, which was, by this time, engine activated, and greasing and performing minor maintenance on the machinery. By 1926, Drawbridge was a full-blown community of about 90 cabins and had 5 passenger trains a day. At least one politician was aware of the community. In 1926, Alan G. Morris was running for Justice of the Peace. He'd heard about the people in Drawbridge from a friend. A visit to the community netted him enough votes to be elected to the office. The 1920s were a great and wonderful time for the people of Drawbridge. It was a paradise for hunters and fishermen alike. It was a town of lasting friendships, independent living, and freedom of the spirit. However, forces were at work that could not be controlled by those on the island, and these forces would prove to be the beginning of the end for the community of Drawbridge. The middle years, 1927 to 1948. Many judgmental forces were beginning to gather around Drawbridge like a dark cloud that would ultimately destroy it. In the Newark and Fremont areas, an increasing number of people and businesses were pumping out the fresh water that lay beneath the salt marshes faster than it could be replaced by nature. This started the subsidence of the land. Deep wells on Station Island began to fail, and the island began to sink. Cabins had to be jacked up again and again, and the railroad had to keep building up the railway bed just to keep it from disappearing. At that time, the communities of the South Bay dumped the raw sewage into the bay. As their populations increased, the natural dilution and filtering abilities of the marshes were overwhelmed. This proved to be a calamity for the water quality of the sloughs surrounding Station Island. Fish and shellfish were adversely affected by the polluted water. Ducks began to leave the marshes, and the hunting, for which most residents of Drawbridge had come out in the first place, decreased. As railroads and highways replaced ships as prime movers in the Bay Area, Warm Springs and Coyote Sloughs were used less and less. Warm Springs Embarcadero Wharf ceased to be a shipping point. Increased diking for salt ponds in the area reduced the natural circulation of water, and the sloughs began to silt in and become less navigable. Diking in the Southwest Bay marshes started in 1926. The Arden Salt Company built 5,000 acres of salt ponds south of Newark. Many small companies started up. All later became part of the Leslie Salt Company. This diking degraded the marine system around Station Island by closing out the tides that kept the waterways open and clean. The Depression also contributed to the demise of Drawbridge. Lack of money could have been one of the reasons for the decreased number of weekend parties and regattas sailing to the island. Also, the new transportation systems of the day were making more remote vacation spots more attractive. Vandalism, non-existent in the 1920s, began about this time and became a terribly destructive force on both the real estate and morale. Last, but not necessarily least, was the generation gap. The early pioneers of Drawbridge were a distinct breed who liked the sport and independence found there, and were willing to put up with the inconveniences of the island. Then, like the farmer's son who grew up hating the farm and left for the city, the second and third generations of some families did not have the zeal for the primitive lifestyle and did not want to carry on. All these problems were not evident in 1928. Life on Station Island went on as usual. Boats were brought up homemade ways for cleaning and repair. Almost everyone had at least one boat. They owned power boats and scull boats. The multi-purpose scull boat was not only used for hunting, but could be rigged for sailing. Their owners often braved the open water of the bay. Most cabin owners had a boathouse that faced a slough with the water side open for easy access. Often the fog would catch boaters out in the sloughs, and like primitive foghorns, their families or friends would yell them in. The people of the Drawbridge also used the railroad track to transport themselves and heavy items from one point to another. Homemade carts were used to transport older people to parties and to the train station, and to move heavy objects such as stoves and refrigerators. They were built of thick planks about 2 feet wide, which spanned the track so the skates or wheels would ride on the rails. Side plates held the boards on the rails, and sails rigged on these contraptions could send them zooming down the tracks. However, if a train was coming, you better get out of the way. There were a few problems to contend with at Drawbridge. Marsh rats were vagrants who often laid over in unoccupied cabins until they were chased out. Gnats were also a problem. At times, one had to wade through them clear up to the waist. These are probably the marsh flies, which are still plentiful today. Mosquitoes were a problem, as they are everywhere. People protected themselves from swallows by holding newspapers over their heads. The several families who lived in Drawbridge full-time had to adapt to an uncommon lifestyle. Chief bridge tender William Carrera and his wife May probably did as well as anyone. He built a house that was called city type by his neighbors because it was so nice. His house was called the Saw and Gun Club. It was built on B Street and required a long raised walkway to the railroad track. They lived a nice life, they thought, for 22 years. They left in 1940 when his position was no longer required. The Holden family came to Drawbridge in 1894, the first full-time residents. Their son William became one of the bridge tenders. The Holden family left in 1940. Edward and Catherine Souza, who lived there full-time, had children who took the train to school in El Viso. There was also a good footpath to El Viso along the railroad track. Some children rode their bicycles to school. Hunter's Home, Sportsman's Hotel, was now owned by Barney Piniella, also co-owner of Piniella Drayage Company in San Jose. The hotel continued to cater to sportsmen until 1943 when it burned down. Barney was working in his pump house when a spark, some say his cigar, started a fire and spilled gasoline on the floor. The pump house burned, then the hotel, then several buildings around it. Again, fire proved to be the terror of the island. Later, Barney built the only two-story house on Station Island on the same property the hotel had occupied. His new house was quite a grand place with a ballroom that boasted a Walworth baby grand piano. He had a full-time cook, and he also had a housekeeper who lived in the second-story room. Pinella was quite interested in the politicos in San Jose and often entertained them there. He also gave parties for both ends of town on special occasions. His grandsons still operate the Pinella Drayage Company. There are three brothers who are also well known on the island: Ike, Al, and George Oswald. Ike owned a butcher shop in San Francisco. They were all great hunters, but Ike was also interested in real estate. Both he and Mr. Sprung bought and sold houses and property. Some of the duck clubs were owned jointly by 4 or 5 people. Ike must have also had a great love for the island, as quite often when people left for good, he would buy their property and hold on to it. These buys include the Gordon Gun Club and the Harbor View. Ike married a woman named Anna who worked for Mrs. Sprung. Mrs. Sprung later willed the Sprung Hotel to Ike, who was her nephew. Ike's own cabin looked like an antique store. It was full of sandwich glass, ironstone, carnival, and cut glass. He also had antique pieces of furniture. Ike closed down the Sprung Hotel in 1930 and boarded it up. Some thought that it was a temporary measure, but it never reopened. He did continue to supply water through a co-op with the Sprung Hotel well. The price went up to $6 a year. Then, in 1940, as vandalism had become a threat, he brought in a freight car and had it parked on the siding by the hotel. He loaded everything from the hotel into the freight car and hauled it to San Francisco, where he sold everything, including Mrs. Sprung's old parrot. It also has been reported that Ike Oswald was responsible for bringing electricity to the island in about 1931. There were 80 subscriptions for electricity in 1933. John Burns started coming to Drawbridge as a very young man. He loved hunting and wanted to be part of the community. He built a cabin on the northwest quadrant of the island and called it the Recreation. He met, courted, and married Ann Deasy. They spent their honeymoon in their new cabin. Both John and Ann were avid duck hunters and also enjoyed swimming with their friends. John worked for the San Francisco Mint. Edward Dowd first started coming to Drawbridge in 1907 when he was 18 years old. He was brother-in-law of May Carrera, William Carrera's wife. The Dowd cabin was named the Sprague Duck Club and was nicely furnished. He owned an electrical company in San Francisco. He had 3 children, 2 girls and a boy. The daughters were interviewed for this publication, and here are some of the remembrances of Marjan Dowd and Leola Domino. They thought it was a great place for children and spent many happy weekends and vacations there. They remembered playing on the large raised deck of their Uncle William Carrera's house. It had swings and a wading pool. One of their pastimes was counting boxcars on the freight trains going by. Another was watering their uncle's garden of potted plants. They remember that falling asleep at night was especially easy. It was probably just from playing hard, but they felt that there must have been some gases that came off the marsh and helped put them to sleep. When asked about heavy drinking, they say absolutely not. Hunters might have a drink or 2 in the evening, but after all, they had to be up at 4 in the morning for a shoot. Loaded guns were not allowed in the cabin. Safety was the rule of the day. They told of people arriving at Drawbridge in nice clothes, even white gloves and patent leather shoes. They brought suitcases with them containing their hunting clothes. Guns had to be broken down and kept in gun cases. Some of these cases were beautifully tooled. When the hunting trips were over, it was on with the nice clothes again. The old clothes and ducks went into the suitcase. One fond memory is of never having anything plastic. All the dishes were china. They tell of drifts of foam from the marsh coming up to the railroad tracks, pinks and blues, looking just like an abstract painting. They remember Billy Robinson, the boat builder, also making guitars and other wood products as well as skull boats. Their mother Mary remembers the island as a paradise and has nothing but fond memories. The 2 sections of Drawbridge still stayed apart. Mothers at the north end warned their kids not to go down to the bad end of town. The north end admitted being cliquey. The south end felt the north end was pretty stuck up. However, troubles on the island were really very few at this time. There's one handed-down story of 2 brothers who got into a fight over their father. Some said it ended in a fist fight, some said not. One version had them meeting on the railroad tracks, one with a gun, the other with a knife. After staring at each other for a while, they turned and left. From then on, when they passed on the tracks, they always shielded their eyes so they couldn't see each other. By 1940, there were only about 50 cabins left. Most of the forces that were to end the idyllic life at Drawbridge were in full swing. Wildlife had been drastically reduced by water pollution. The smell of raw sewage was evident, and the stinking of the island from rapid groundwater removal continued. No longer were swimmers seen in the sloughs. The last straw was added in the form of newspaper articles telling about the ghost town on the bay, telling of cabins filled with antiques abandoned by their owners. It was true that quite a few people had locked up their cabins with all their furniture inside, but there is no evidence that they had abandoned them. Some people, believing what they read, came out and broke into cabins, stealing everything worthwhile. Some of the residents even had people try to break in while they were there. It was heartbreaking for those who came out to find their cabins not only broken into, but vandalized. They found broken windows, smashed stoves and refrigerators, and bullet holes everywhere. Some fixed up their cabins again and again, unwilling to give up. Some even tried to appeal to the persons doing the damage with notices on the door. "Please don't shoot my house." Of course, the vandals did. Another sign said, "Dear thieves and vandals, please do not break into this house. It's the only home we have. Inside are things of little value to anyone else, and most of them are essential to our existence." Thank you, John and Barbara. By the end of the 40s, Coyote and Warm Springs sloughs were virtually unused as the silt made them difficult to navigate. Wells were fouling and becoming unusable. Even so, there were some people who would not give up the living there full time. The island's isolation and independent living still had its charm. Chapter 4. The Final Years, 1949 to 1979. In spite of all the increasing problems on Station Island, there were still people who loved it. There were some who continued to vacation, weekend, and live there. It was a time when painters, photographers, and writers found the village. There also were people who had known about the place and finally came out and built or bought cabins in these later years. One of these people was Al Evans. He and his wife came to the island in the 1950s and had a cabin in the southwest quadrant. An interview with them produced many remembrances and stories that they had heard. Some have been incorporated in previous chapters and won't be repeated here. They have a fierce love for their place and still want to have unrestricted access to their cabin, the Don't Worry Club, even if they can't stay there. The Evans have many fond memories of staying on the island. Just a great place to be, having friends for supper, enjoying the company of their fellow Drawbridgers, and appreciating the quiet and solitude of the cabin. One evening, Mrs. Evans was cooking with boots on in her kitchen. It was high tide, and maybe the cabin needed jacking up a bit. Well, a fish swam in through the door, then underneath the stove, and then back out the back door. This was certainly a different sort of fish story. It was still fun at Drawbridge. The downside, of course, was the continued vandalism. The Evans cabin was broken into many times. Al Evans related the story about the Dear Thieves and Vandals notice. An extreme problem was caused in the late 50s when 2 salt ponds were created by building levees on Station Island itself. This cut off almost all the water flow through the island. It also covered up the Washington Cutoff Slough that flowed from the Warm Springs Slough to the Coyote Slough, 100 yards or so west of the railroad tracks. Access by boat became extremely limited. By the 1960s, there were problems with what the people at Drawbridge would call dopers. These people would come out to Drawbridge, break into a cabin, and throw a dope party. Also, the dopers' families would come out and try to take over a cabin. It didn't work. One family was chased out with an axe, another with a shotgun. Dopers were not welcome. One night, about 50 of them came out, broke into a cabin, and started a party. Some of the regular residents called the Fremont police. They came out. What to do with 50 people under arrest on an island with no connecting roads to the city? Well, the police borrowed coat hangers from the residents, wired all the dopers together, and marched them off to jail. There were a lot of suspicious fires. There had always been fires. Some were thought to be caused by cinders from the trains. Insurance payments may have been a factor in other fires. Of course, vandalism was a contributory factor. With no fire department on the island and lack of access for Fremont area firefighters, Fires continue to be a real problem. There were many things happening during these years. In 1955, the Coyote Slough Bridge was replaced by a trestle. The need for opening the bridge was no longer required. Trains no longer stopped on a regular basis, but could be flagged down for a ride. It was reported that the banks of the sloughs were black from raw sewage. Robbie Robinson's cabin was burned in 1964. There were 42 taxed residences and a population of 25 in 1967. It was also reported in the newspaper that there was a cluster of houses that had fresh paint, glass in the windows, and that the houses were set well above the tide level. John Pacheco and Louis E. Holden, who lived there, complained that the ghost town name really hurt the town. In 1968, the Sprung Hotel collapsed in a windstorm. There was some evidence of fire, but the Fremont Fire Department has no record of it. In May of 1968, 11 places in the northeast quadrant burned down during a big windstorm. Some of the cabins that burned were Julie Lodge, Widgeon, Tony Gun Club, Gordon House, the Dowd, Schumacher, and Murdoch houses. On July 4, 1968, 7 structures burned in the northeast quadrant. In 1970, the old railroad station was torn down by Southern Pacific to reduce possible liability. This year also saw the end of the Sprung Water Co-op. 1 resident and 24 taxed residences were reported in 1976. The last 2 people to live in Drawbridge were Nellie Irene Dolan and Charlie Luce. Nellie left in 1974 and Charlie left in 1979. Al Evans described Nellie as beautiful and gorgeous. The fellows at Drawbridge went gaga over her. His wife agreed with him and said her personality was even more beautiful. Most of the following information is from taped conversations with these 2 people in 1978 by an archaeology crew from California State University, Hayward, which was conducting a surface survey for the San Francisco Bay National Wildlife Refuge. Nellie started going out to Drawbridge in 1910 when she was 10 years old. She would visit her father in his cabin. Nellie's sister and mother didn't like the island, but she did. Later, her mother and father divorced, and the father remarried. Nellie continued to visit him and her stepmother. Her father, an avid duck hunter, was a dentist in San Francisco. He died in 1937 on Whitney Island near Milpitas. He had shot 2 ducks, picked up one, and as he stooped to pick over the second one, had a heart attack. A friend who was with him said that about the time he died, nearly 500 ducks flew overhead, as if in salute. Nellie felt that he died happy doing what he loved best. She told to bring her boyfriend out on the train to visit her father and stepmother in 1918. They were coming from Oakland, and as they approached the island, the conductor told her that the train was not going to stop. Her father was waiting at the station. As the train went by, she yelled, "Gee, Pop, the train won't stop!" Her father and one of the bridge tenders got a handcar, and they went to Milpitas to pick up Nellie and her friend. Nellie bought her first house in 1932. It was in the northeast quadrant, and she lived there into the 1960s. As time went by, she felt she needed more room. Mr. Reinhardt, the powerboat builder, had his machine shop beneath Nellie's cabin. He sold the cabin to her and left Drawbridge. She had a raised platform built on the back of her cabin. Then some friends of hers, with the aid of 2-inch pipes, rolled Reinhardt's cabin up to the back of hers and hoisted it onto the ready platform. Now she had more room. She had fixed up her own house. We had beautiful linoleum and tile, kind of like flagstone, you know, from Armstrong, red tile. I had it real nice, she says. During the taped interview with the university archaeologist, the question was asked if Reinhardt worked on just the boats of the people on the island. Just the people here, because everybody had a launch in those days, you know, inboard motors. Everybody had their scull boats for hunting. There were even some sailboats here. Everyone came for weekends, Saturday and Sunday. They would swim and go boating, fishing. Good clams out there in the slough, mud clams. They got shrimp in a net, fish for smelt, and striped bass. Nellie married 3 times and was divorced 3 times, and always came back to Drawbridge. She had 3 sons. In the 1940s, she worked in San Francisco and commuted on the Lark. She worked at the Elks Club in San Jose in the late 40s and 50s, commuting on the Daylight. When asked if the people in the south end of town were a fast crowd, she said, Oh, no, they were not. But hadn't her father told her to stay away from the South End? Well, when I was a kid, he didn't care for those people. We were kind of cliquey. All of us stayed up here, and we didn't mix much with those other people down there, because they were mostly Portuguese or French people. But no, they weren't wild. No wilder than anybody else. Charlie Lou said, well, there was some out-and-out feuding, like Bill Holden and his brother Lou. They went for years without speaking, shielding their faces with a newspaper, Ellie said. Well, that's family. Bill Holden was kind of mean. He was a prize fighter, I think. Well, anyway, Louis was over talking to his dad one day. Louis liked his old man. And Bill came in and started beating his daddy up. And Louis Holden pitched in on Bill. And Bill ended up with some broken ribs from it. Yeah, that happened. When asked if she spent a lot of time boating, Nellie replied, oh, yes, I loved boating, but I never learned how to swim. I had 3 sons, and they all know how to swim, but they won't teach me. I sure wish I could, because I love the water. I had these pet ducks, about 6 mallards, looked just like soldiers marching along. I had some quail, too, but they were pretty hard to take care of. One of her interesting stories about life on the island was about high tide parties. When real high tide came along, the water would come up to the level of her porch. Then friends could bring their boats right up to her house and tie up. They would have a nice party, convenient to get to, and then row home. Nellie also told of waiting for the train in the 1960s. As the train no longer made a regular stop, she would flag one down with a handkerchief. She told of vandalism in the 1960s while she was living in her house in the northeast quadrant. A lot of people left everything in their cabins and locked them up, assuming they would be safe, but they were broken into and looted. When they vandalized her place, they broke all the windows, broke the stove, the refrigerator, everything. It was terrible. She was unhappy that the rumor had started that Drawbridge was a ghost town. She then moved into a small 2-room cabin in the northwest corner. Nellie related the following tale to explain why she finally left Drawbridge. Oh my God, that was a terrible night. Yeah, my granddaughter and I were here in the house. We were alone, and it was a moonlit night, and we were watching television. It was about 9 p.m., and I came out here for a look around, and I see these 2 kids were shouting and yelling. You know, they were drunk. They kicked down the front door out there, a special door in her walkway, not the house door. And that time I shot the gun out the window, and everything was dead still. That was enough for Nellie. She moved to Hayward, California. She was affectionately called Shotgun Nellie by her sons. Charlie Luce was born in 1914 and started going to Drawbridge in 1930 while he was still in high school. He and a friend wanted to buy Robbie Robinson's cabin. However, the price of $200 was just too much for them. He returned in 1938 while working for Pacific Gas and Electric Company, but didn't buy a place. In 1950, he returned with a group of friends and bought the Sunset Club for $400 from a man named Ritchie. In 1964, the Robinson and Sunset Club were torched. In 1964-65, Charlie and some friends formed the Duck Club and bought the Benedette House. He started living there full-time in 1974 with his dog Quincy. He stayed until October 1979 when he was bought out by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and had to leave. You can't live on a wildlife refuge. One of Charlie's hobbies was searching for artifacts. He used a long pointed stick and would push it down in the mud until he struck something hard. He would dig down and retrieve whatever was there. Sometimes he found old bottles and sometimes old stoves. Because of salt-soaked wood they burned, the stoves didn't last long. Dumping them into the marsh was a quick way to get rid of them. He explained that if he did not retrieve the object he was digging for within a few hours, the water and mud would ooze back in, and within a week the spot would be hidden by pickleweed. Don't bother starting an environmental impact study here. By next week you might not be able to find what you were trying to measure today. Charlie told of the vandalism that was increasingly plaguing the town. He had a burglar alarm on his front door. Why, they shoot bullets through my house even when I was sitting in here. Vandals were always breaking in. It's happened 4 times since I've been here. When that alarm on the front door goes off, it only seems to make them more curious and they come right on in. They put their hands up and face the wall. I wouldn't think of being out here without a gun. Charlie would run them right off Station Island. Chapter 5. The Refuge. Station Island and Drawbridge are now part of the San Francisco Bay National Wildlife Refuge. The Wildlife Refuge was established because of the concern of many groups for the preservation of the San Francisco Bay. The Bay Conservation and Development Commission, a state agency established in 1968, brought a reduction to the dredging and filling of the bay, which had reduced the marsh habitat by 2/3 from 1947 to 1967, and had threatened the complete loss of the wetlands. A perspective can be gained when you find that only 5% of the marshlands are left now from what they were in 1900. The South San Francisco Baylands Planning, Conservation, and National Wildlife Refuge Committee, formed in 1968, became one of the major forces in the establishment of a National Wildlife Refuge in the South Bay. Through their efforts, numerous bills were presented to Congress. In May 1970, the Secretary of the Interior asked the Bureau of Sport, Fisheries, and Wildlife to make feasibility study on the proposed refuge. The report was finished in 1972. On its recommendation, Congress passed Bill PL 92-330, which directed the Secretary of the Interior to establish a National Wildlife Refuge in the South San Francisco Bay. Drawbridge was listed in the master plan for the refuge, and several suggestions for its preservation were considered. However, none of the plans bore fruit, and the only change has been the replacement of the Warm Springs Slough Bridge by the Southern Pacific in 1987. The refuge has no plans for Drawbridge. Nature is going to take its own course, and when the hamlet is gone, the area will be left that way. By the fall of 1981, free tours were offered to the public every Saturday from 10 a.m. to 1 p.m. The tours left the visitor center in Fremont by van and were brought to a parking area just north of the Warm Springs Slough Bridge. A visit through Nellie's and Charlie's cabins was part of the tour. After Charlie Luce left in 1979, several aspects of Drawbridge did not change. Vandalism continued on a weekly basis. It was seldom that you could visit the area without seeing another wall torn down, a hole chopped in the roof, or something broken or smashed. Fires also continued to plague the island. In 1983, the Pinella two-story house burned to the ground, along with several cabins near it. The last cabin that Nellie lived in was burned in 1984, and Charlie's place burned in 1986. The quality of the tours was greatly reduced by these last two fires. The current tour season is May 1 to October 31st. The number of tours and days that are given are determined each year. For information and a reservation, call area code 415-792-0222. The island is otherwise closed to the public. Drawbridge lived 103 years, from 1876 to 1979, and of course still lives in the memories of those who experienced the island's life. The pickleweed and marsh grass are still green, and the orange dodder still highlights the marsh. 20-odd cabins are defying the prediction that they would soon all be gone. They are hanging in there, and are still a delight for the visitors, especially artists and photographers. The remains of Drawbridge seem to be determined to stay as long as the memories last.